Can you imagine being locked in by 15 of your own brothers and cousins, frozen where you stand, paralyzed, unsure what to do next? I am 78 years old now, born in 1946. What I'm about to tell you began in 1960, the year I had just turned 14. To the neighbors, our house looked blessed, land well kept, a father admired for his discipline, a family whose rules gleamed like polished cutlery on the table. But order can be a costume, and silence, though it pretends to keep the peace, can be the very thing that breaks a child. Picture it the way it truly was. The bell at 5 each morning, the kettle breathing on the hob, boots crossing stone with measured certainty, doors keysed with a neat click, a tin on the dresser labeled "spare keys," and those keys never left my father's pocket. At meals, we kept our eyes down. Respectability didn't need to shout. It had the locks. One afternoon, the curtains were drawn at noon, though there was no harsh light to soften. I heard the lock turn, just a small, almost polite sound, and the corridor behind me filled with the boys I had grown up beside. No one raised a voice. No one needed to. In that instant, I understood something a child should never have to learn. The danger I had been warned about beyond our gate had been living at home all along. I will not give you cruel detail. I will use plain words, because plain words can hold heavy truths. Over the next hour, I will lift the edge of that curtain and show you how a house praised by the village could hide a room where the air felt borrowed, how the hush we called discipline became a weapon, and how one small object no larger than a palm would one day help me turn the lock the other way. You will meet my father, a man whose boots and bells spoke even in his absence, my quiet stepmother who let tea grow cold in her cup, the elder boys who walked like their father, and one pair of eyes, Charlie's, that at last would not look away. Before I go on, may I ask something gentle of you? Tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight. Share your name too, so I may know who keeps me company. And if you wish, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. It gives me the courage to keep speaking. If you are here, I will be brave. From 1906 to 1960 to now, I will name what should have been named long ago. That was the day the silence in our house changed its sound. I grew up in a house that woke the same way each day. The bell at 5, the kettle breathing on the hob, boots crossing the flagstones in a steady line. I was the only girl in a world arranged for boys and for a father who believed order was a virtue you could hear in the way a latch clicked shut. From the lane, our farmhouse looked admirable stone scrubbed to a soft sheen. Hedges clipped square, the yard swept before breakfast. Inside, the corridor ran like a spine through the house. Rooms opened off it with a neat, practiced certainty. Respectability was not a decoration. It was a discipline we wore. Even as a child, I understood that survival meant learning the house's grammar. Speak softly, move carefully, keep the rules with the same precision you lay out cutlery. It was safer to be almost invisible. My father, Harold Whitfield, did not need to shout. His shoulders, his boots, his keys did the speaking. Family looks after its own, he liked to say, and by looks after, he meant gathers in. So the house filled, his older sons from before, the boys that came after, and cousins sent for a better chance, until there were 15 in all. The older boys slept in the east wing, where men's conversations happened behind half-shut doors. The middle set carried tools and messages. The youngest were folded into narrow beds in the west wing and learned quickly by correction. Leaving the property required permission. Visitors arrived with my father or not at all. Clothes were plain, voices low, manners exact. At the table we kept our eyes on our plates, while grace and schedule moved in the same measured line. Discipline didn't argue. It arranged itself and waited for you to fit. Certain objects did more talking than people. A small tin on the dresser neatly labeled "spare keys" looked harmless, but it meant my father's hand was the hinge of every room. The keys rarely left his pocket. A teacup near my stepmother's elbow would be poured and left to cool. Rose rarely drank it. That cooling cup was a picture of the life we kept, something once warm, allowed to go quiet. Letters arrived bound with string, went straight to the study, and were opened out of sight. Later, when a room changed hands or a task was reassigned, no one mentioned the letters at all. Even sounds became symbols. The bell at 5, the aga's soft breath, the tidy click of a latch, the van's engine fading down the lane on a Friday afternoon. The house kept time, and we kept to it. My room was small, an iron bed, a narrow wardrobe that had been my grandmother's, a window over the yard where hens scratched and washing lines moved like slow flags. My stepmother, Rose, carried lavender and carbolic in her hands and moved through the rooms as if keeping a banked fire, never letting it flare, never letting it die. With Mrs. Connolly, she ran the kitchen like a quiet regiment. My days were measured in small obediences, pegging the wash in even lines, polishing cutlery till it held the light, minding the hens, pressing a jacket until the cloth remembered the crease. Meanwhile, the decisions that steered us all were made in my father's study. I passed that door often enough to learn the sound of a verdict even when I could not hear the words. Reason told me to keep my head down, feeling wanted air. I learned to breathe more quietly than the house. We were close enough to hear the village bell on a clear morning, yet a mile of track mud in winter, dust in summer, kept us apart. My father liked it that way. "Here I know what happens," he would say. And he did. Who left the yard and when? The weight of a milk pail by the sound it made, the small change in a boy's voice when he hid something. Distance kept temptations out, he said. It also kept in things no one was meant to see. On certain evenings, the house sounded perfect. The clink of cutlery, the murmur of a psalm, the door closing against the night, and even I nearly believed the music of it. But under the polish lived another note, a low hum you only notice when everything else goes still. I did not yet know its price, only that the air felt heavier when my father's van faded down the lane on Fridays, and that the keys in his pocket glinted even when he wasn't in the room. It was a Friday in early spring, ain't 60, the kind of afternoon when the sky sits low and the fields smell faintly of damp soil. My father, Harold Whitfield, finished his tea, checked the ledger, and said he had business in town, cattle to price, papers to sign. He put on his tweed, slipped the keys back into his pocket, and the van went down the lane in that measured, unhurried way I knew so well. The house exhaled, but it was not relief. The light changed. Voices in the east wing dropped to a murmur. Someone drew the curtains in a room that did not usually need them at noon. I was called from the scullery to help with something, and the corridor that I had walked since childhood felt suddenly narrower. A door I knew as the tool store stood ajar, where it was always shut. Inside, things were not as they had been. A blanket straightened, a chair moved to the corner, the window curtained. I heard the latch behind me make that small, polite sound that decided so much in our house. I will not use cruel detail. I will only tell you what is necessary to understand. 15 boys I had grown up among were near enough that their breath stirred the air, and there was no adult present who would say my name like a rescue. That night I did not sleep. The clock on the landing counted in iron, and with every strike I found a part of myself holding tighter to the pillow as if it could anchor me up. In the morning, I moved through the kitchen like a shadow stitched to the floor. The simple things that used to steady me failed: the smell of toast, the steam of the kettle, the comfort of a clean apron. My hands shook when I lifted plates. The cup at Rose's elbow cooled, untouched, and in its pale skin I saw my own. At the table, the older boys talked in the tidy way my father liked them to talk. One or two would glance and then look away, as if the looking itself were an offense. Fear taught my body new habits: how to fold in on itself, how to find the widest part of a wall and lean without appearing to need it, how to hold breath when a boot step sounded in the corridor. I learned in a single night that silence is not neutral. It takes sides, and it took theirs. I kept to the pattern because the pattern was all I had. The bell at 5, water on, floors swept, shirts boiled, collars pressed. I pegged the washing in neat lines and watched it bow to the wind, as if the yard were telling me what I must do: bend and not break. The small objects that once seemed harmless began to speak too plainly. The spare keys tin glittered each time the door opened, a reminder that every hinge in the house answered to one hand. The curtained window in the storeroom curtains that had no reason to be there became a picture I could not unsee. Even the lane itself felt changed. When the van's engine faded on a Friday, my heart learned to count the hours until it returned. I tried to make tea and drink it while warm, the way I had promised myself, but it cooled at my wrist while I stood at the sink, watching the glass mist where my breath landed. Routine kept my feet moving. It did not make the floor steady. I was 14, and already I understood too well how a child can be taught to confuse quiet with safety. If you are listening to me now, wherever you are, whatever age you have reached, perhaps you know that confusion too. Perhaps you have kept a silence because it seemed kinder or tidier or safer for everyone else. Did it protect you, or did it, as mine did, become a room with the window curtained at noon and the latch closing softly behind you? I cannot change what happened on that Friday, but I can say its name in plain words, so that the quiet between us is no one's weapon. The week after that first Friday passed in a slow, careful hush. I kept the routine because routine was all I had. The bell at 5, water on, floors swept, shirts boiled, collars pressed, the yard brushed till the flags showed their old light. But Friday returned as Fridays do, and with it the small changes one only notices when one is watching for them. The older boys gathered earlier. Their talk, once drifting like smoke, grew tidier, shorter, more deliberate. Doors that normally stood open acquired the habit of being just ajar. Someone had straightened the blanket in the tool room again. Someone had drawn the curtains, though there was no sun to blunt. I learned that fear has a timetable. I learned that a child can count not by hours, but by the distance of an engine on the lane. After the second Friday, the air in the house changed its weight. I moved along the skirting like a shadow that had learned to keep to the edges. People say an ordered home is calm. They forget that a calm surface can make a deeper silence, one that listens to itself. By the third Friday, I knew where not to walk and when not to breathe. That is what escalation looked like in our house. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud, only the tidiness of harm becoming ordinary. If there had been a crack in the image my father presented to the village, perhaps light could have entered there. But the village saw what it wished to see. A man who took in his kin, a house that ran like a clock, boys kept busy and out of trouble. On Saturdays, when the elder two were allowed into town, they returned before dusk as required clean collars, polite nods, the shape of my father's approval worn like a jacket that fit. Neighbors praised him at the shop and after church. Harold keeps a firm hand, and isn't it needed these days? Praise has a way of turning to pressure. It made the floors shinier and the rules tighter. Rose, gentle as ever, kept the kitchen steady, her cup cooling by her elbow while the world applauded a quiet it did not understand. I felt the approval as a weight on my shoulders. It taught me that telling would be not only disloyal, but unthinkable. A good house, they said, is a closed circle. A safe house, they believed, is the one whose doors do not swing for strangers. I looked at our closed doors and thought, the danger they keep out is nothing compared with the danger they keep in. But who exactly was I to say so? I was 14, a girl, and our order had endorsements. My first attempt at salvation was to pretend so well that the truth would tire and go elsewhere. I made my bed with the sharper corners. I aligned the cutlery till the forks matched their own reflections. I spoke when spoken to, and only then, hands folded, eyes kept level with the table's edge. I told myself that if I copied the house's neatness closely enough, I might become part of its furniture, useful, unremarkable, safe. The body learns a choreography under duress. Mine learned to pass a doorway without pausing, to measure the length of a corridor by breath counts, to time a step with the passage of a boot in the opposite direction. For a week, it almost worked not to remove the fear, but to blur it, to tuck it into the hymns of tasks that had to be done. But pretending is labor, and labor leaves traces. I began dropping things a spoon against stone, a plate against the sink rim. Each sound Drew eyes had tried so hard to avoid. The more perfectly I arranged the day, the more I noticed what perfection was covering. By the time the next Friday came, I understood what I had not wished to know. Keeping the surface glossy does not change the water beneath. It only makes the reflection lie more beautifully. The second idea was kindness, small, precise offerings meant to soften the edges. An extra portion carried to a boy who looked worn, a shirt pressed again because the first crease did not please, a door left a little wider, so a room felt less like a box. For a handful of days, the house loosened by a thread. Voices gentled. The yard sounded almost like a place where work is simply work. Then the telephone rang. I wiped my hands and answered. My father's voice traveled the line as neatly as his handwriting. He would be longer on his next Friday papers to wait for. A buyer not yet at his desk, a stop at the solicitor's. The words were ordinary. Their effect was not longer, meant more hours with the van away, more time for a schedule I did not write. That evening, the boys were quieter, not less. The quiet had purpose. My kindnesses wilted. They had been herbs in a gale. It is a hard thing to learn that goodness, offered into a system designed to keep its own weather, does not change the wind. I rinsed 2 cups and watched the steam lift from the sink like breath leaving a room. By the time I dried my hands, the house had returned to its old, efficient stillness, as if my small attempts had been chalk on a wet stone. Exhaustion set in, not the simple kind that heavy work brings, but the kind that creeps from the bones outward. Sleep found me late and left me early. When it came, it was thin, woven through with the sound of latches and the measured tread of boots. I startled at small things, the clink of glass. A chair scraped an inch too far, a name said quickly in the corridor. Anger visited. In short, bright flashes, a spoon set down too hard, a drawer closed too firmly. Then left me ashamed of the noise I had made. I began to recognize how the body bargains with itself. Shoulders curved to make me smaller. Hands learned to occupy themselves when my voice could not. My chest found a way to carry 2 airs, the one I breathed to keep alive, and the one I locked away so as not to trouble anyone else. There is a cost to such management. You begin to forget what your own face looks like when it is not arranging itself to be acceptable. You start to think in the grammar of the house. If you can be flawless, you can be safe. If you can be silent enough, you can be good. I believed it because belief was cheaper than hope, and I could not yet afford hope. And then something shifted, not in the house, which kept to its rhythm, but in a single gaze. One of the youngest, Charlie, slight and watchful, looked at me and did not look away, not defiance, not pity, just attention, clean and unadorned. Later, in the yard, where damp earth holds the day's last warmth, he came near enough to speak without being heard. "Are you all right?" 4 words, small as a match head, and yet they made light. No one had asked me that in a way that expected an answer. I could not give one then. The body needs time to remember speech. But the question stayed. It followed me along the corridor, into the scullery, past the dresser where the spare keys tin caught the end of the afternoon sun. A question, I learned, can be a tool as sharp as a key. It can open what fear has closed. I did not yet know how to turn it. I knew only this. If there was to be any way out, it would begin with someone seeing and someone staying. In a house that rewarded silence, the first kindness arrived as 4 ordinary words. "Are you all right?" It was Charlie, the slight, watchful one, who learned quickly not the tasks the older boys prized, but the art of staying out of their storms. I had noticed him on Fridays, the way he lingered in the yard, the way a cough or a headache found him at the exact hour the van's engine faded down the lane. Others mocked his softness. I saw a boy building distance with what little he had. That evening, under the old sycamore, where the last heat of the day gathers in the roots, he stood close enough to speak without being heard. I did not tell him everything at once. A body that has been punished for sound must relearn the weight of a sentence. But the truth traveled in pieces, and he held each piece without dropping it or asking me to hurry. Within me, the decision formed, not grand, not brave in any shining sense, only necessary. If there was to be a way out, I would have to stop treating silence as shelter. I would have to trust someone who could see me and stay. We needed a way to speak without the house hearing. We made a small language of harmless things. If I left a pebble on the scullery windowsill, it meant meet me after chores by the low stone wall that bordered the brook. If he tied a blade of grass into the wire of the hen run, it meant wait until the lamps were out. He had something to tell me. We practiced saying nothing while saying enough passing by each other at the pump, pausing half a beat longer at the wash line, setting down a pail with a touch that meant later. I watched him more closely and saw what fear had taught him. On Fridays he was always last to volunteer, always useful elsewhere, always ready with a reason that sounded dutiful. He did not refuse with defiance. He slipped the noose before it tightened in those quiet exchanges. Something I had not felt in months returned a slender thread of steadiness. It was not safety yet, but it was shape. Hope arrived in the pocket of the very order that had trapped us. One Thursday, my father came home with a small battery recorder no larger than a palm bought, he said, to keep notes when he met buyers and solicitors. He held it up at supper, proud of its tidy usefulness, and let the tape whir for our benefit. Modern convenience, he called it, as the red eye blinked like a quiet thought. That night, the recorder's shape would not leave my mind. The weight it would have hidden in a sleeve, the soft press of the button, the way a chair might shelter it if placed just so. I left a pebble on the sill. At the wall after dark, I told Charlie what I had seen and what it could mean. His face changed not with fear alone, but with the careful arithmetic of risk. We spoke of practical things, where the sound in that room would fall, how to muffle the click, how long the tape might run. I touched the device in my mind until it became a tool and not a terror. We made a plan simple enough to remember under pressure. On Friday, when the house turned to its other timetable, I would carry the recorder in the folded hem of my cardigan and slide it beneath the old chair in the corner before anyone noticed my hands. I would press the button as I bent, as if retrieving a dropped pin. We tested the movement in the pantry once, twice, until my fingers knew the path without thought. When the van returned and the house put its face back on, I would recover the device and pass it to Charlie. His task, harder in its way, would be to carry it to my father at first light on Sunday and say he had found it in the yard and out of curiosity had played it. He would not accuse anyone. He would let the tape speak the plain words I could not yet survive saying in that room. We both understood why this might work. My father cared about many things: order, obedience, his name among neighbors. Reputation was the one lock he kept oiled. If he believed there existed a recording that could travel beyond our gate, he would act not out of pity, but out of fear of the world he thought he had kept out. We rehearsed what Charlie would say, small, tidy sentences a boy could plausibly carry. Then we did the part plans never write down. We counted the cost. If we were discovered, he would be called weak and useless. I would be called a liar, or worse. We looked at those outcomes as calmly as we could and did not look away. When we parted at the wall, the night felt colder, but my hands were steady. For the first time since the first Friday, I could imagine turning a lock the other way. Friday returned with its practiced calm. The van went down the lane. The house rearranged itself into the timetable that no one admitted existed. I carried the recorder folded into the hem of my cardigan, the weight of it no more than a pocket of coins, and yet heavier than anything I had ever worn. In the doorway of that room, the one whose curtains were drawn at noon, I let my hands be clumsy. I bent as if to find a lost pin, slid the device beneath the old chair in the corner, and pressed the button with the knuckle that would not be seen. The red eye blinked once, then hid. After that, there is nothing I will describe except what the room sounded like: the scrape of wood, the sift of breath, the low orders a house learns to obey, plain words, not cruel ones. The tape collected what my voice could not yet carry. When it was over, and the van's engine returned along the lane, the house pulled its face back into place. I waited for the corridor to empty, knelt as if straightening a rug, and lifted the recorder. It was warm in my hand, the way a truth is warm when it has been spoken aloud. I hid it where I had promised myself I would, and that night I slept in a series of shallow bays, not on open water, but nearer land than I had been for months. At first light on Sunday, Charlie kept his part. He knocked, careful as a boy who has ever learned to knock loudly, and asked my father if he might have a word in the study. Rose moved about the kitchen in her quiet way. I dried the cups I had already dried, listening for what could not be heard from that far end of the corridor. Later, Charlie told me what I had already guessed. He said he had found the device in the yard near the bins, that curiosity had made him press the switch, and that what he heard had sickened him. He did not accuse. He placed the recorder on the desk and stood still while my father turned it on. The study is lined with books that smell faintly of dust and polish. On that morning, it held a different air. The tape ran. You can measure a man not only by the noise he makes, but by the quiet he cannot hold. Harold Whitfield did not shout. He listened, and the silence grew so strict that even the house seemed to obey it. When the tape clicked to its end, he rewound it, as if repeating it might return him to an earlier fact. Then he rose, smoother than I would have believed a man could rise, and said, "Fetch them." Not compassion, not shock, a decision. They came in twos and threes, buttoning collars, smoothing hair, reading my father's face the way we all had learned to read it. He gathered them first in the study, then in the yard, because the room would not hold so many. Rose and I had stood at the threshold like part of the furniture present, not included yet. He held up the recorder as if it were a tool he knew intimately, and had only just discovered a second use for. "Do you know what this is?" he asked, and waited until the yard understood that an answer was not required. He spoke of disgrace and of name, of the order of a household and the duty of sons. He did not speak of me. If he condemned anything, it was the breach, not the harm, the risk to reputation, not the wound to a child. The boys' men, by posture, if not by years, shifted their weight and studied the ground. A few looked, quickly, in my direction, then away. My father's voice stayed level, the way a blade stays level. He did not strike with his hands. He did something cleaner in his own mind. He rearranged the map of authority, so that this could not happen again without his permission. It is a hard thing to witness the way order protects itself, and yet, as I watched him place the recorder on the wall and speak of the world beyond our gate, I felt something ease inside me. The lie had been made to say its own name. In the days that followed, the house altered its performance. Doors stayed open that had been half shut. Keys were kept on a hook that had always been there and somehow never used. Friday afternoons were spoken of as ordinary again. None of this returned what had been taken. None of it made me a child once more, but it changed the air enough that I could breathe the same breath from room to room. I did not speak to clear anyone's conscience. I did not rush to forgive because a speech had been made. What I did was simpler and harder. I kept standing where the truth had placed me. When someone tried to call it misunderstanding, I said no. When someone called it a shame to be tidily covered, I said no again. I could not make my father into a man he was not, nor the boys into brothers they had never been. I could decide that my silence would not be used as evidence of peace. That is what a boundary meant in our house, the steadiness to refuse the tidy version. I had thought courage would feel like shouting. It did not. It felt like holding a plain line in a room that preferred embroidery. It felt at last like turning the lock the other way. In the first days after the tape had been heard, and my father had arranged his version of order, I moved through the farmhouse as if learning a new language formed from old words. The rooms were the same rooms. The corridor kept its shine. The bell still sounded at 5. Yet the air had altered. Doors stayed open that had once been half shut, and when a latch did close, it did so without the small dagger of dread that used to follow its click. Exhaustion clung to me like a wet shawl. Sleep arrived in pieces, 1 hour, then 2. Never the deep river I remembered from childhood, but water, nonetheless. I woke fewer times to the ghost of boots on stone. When I crossed the yard, I felt my shoulders settling a fraction lower, as if the sky had risen an inch. No one apologized. Apologies would have been out of character for our house. The boys learned to keep distance in a way that looked like politeness. Rose continued to pour tea she did not drink, but now she sometimes moved the cup closer to her, as if to borrow its warmth. My father hung the keys on a hook by the study door, an act so small that only those who had waited on those keys would register it. The village noticed nothing, which is to say, it noticed everything. It already believed. But in our rooms, the sound of silence changed. It still held rules, but it no longer took my breath without asking. Healing did not arrive like weather turning. It came as small, stubborn rituals that asked little and returned much. Each morning I opened the curtains before lighting the stove, so that daylight, not discipline, was the first thing in the room. I made tea and drank it while it was still warm, an ordinary act, a quiet declaration. I wrote a few lines each evening in a cheap notebook, tucked behind the wardrobe backboard, not a narrative, only fragments. Wind over the field, boots less loud, slept. Sometimes I walked to the church when no service was on and sat where the stone keeps its cool, breathing the kind of silence that is chosen and therefore kind. Sometimes I stood at the garden wall and watched the hens make their busy maps across the yard, grateful for creatures that move without pretending. Charlie and I became experts at the language of ordinary company, fetching milk together without speaking of Fridays, checking the hen-run wire without speaking of rooms that had their curtains drawn at noon. The point was not to pretend nothing had happened. The point was to let normal objects belong to themselves again. The spare keys, tin as a tin and not a threat. The teacup as warmth kept, not warmth abandoned. Letters as ink and paper rather than rumors carried by string. In those small fidelities, I recovered a form of ownership over my time, my breath, even my quiet. I learned that silence when I choose it is rest, silence. When chosen for me is harm. The difference became a boundary I could feel with my hands. Looking back across the years, from 1940s to now, I can name the lesson that took me longest to learn. Silence is not safety. It is only the pause between harms when harm is in charge. What saved me was not a single heroic moment. It was the plain work of telling the truth once and then refusing to let the tidy version replace it. The recorder was no miracle. It was a tool that allowed plain words to stand where I could not yet stand. The rest, sleep returning, breath easing, rooms opening, came from a steadiness I would never have discovered if I had kept my mouth shut to make the house look good. As for forgiveness, I use the word carefully. To forgive is not to forget, nor to excuse, nor to re-enter a room because someone has polished its floor. Forgiveness, as I understand it, is remembering without allowing the memory permission to harm you further. It is what happens when the keys hang on a hook and are no longer the hinge of your day, when the teacup is warmed and drunk, when a letter is simply a letter and not a substituted decree. It is not a speech. It is the unremarkable act of living without flinching in the places where you once learned to flinch. Courage, in the end, has no trumpet. It is the quiet line you keep, day after day, even when a whole house prefers embroidery. And meaning is what that quiet line makes possible for one girl, then for the woman she grows into, and perhaps for anyone who needs to hear that plain words can hold heavy truths and set them down. If you have been listening in the quiet because your own house has taught you to be quiet, I would like to offer 2 small, safe steps. First, write one sentence in a place only you can reach inside a notebook, the notes on your phone, the back of an old envelope. The sentence is simple. Cadence is not my safety. Read it aloud once, softly, so your ears hear what your heart already knows. Second, tell one trustworthy person one small truth. Not the whole story, just one clear line you can stand by tomorrow. If you do not yet have such a person, choose a space that keeps confidence a helpline, a GP, a chaplain, a support worker at the library. Small steps are not small when they move you towards air. Before we part tonight, may I ask something gentle of you? Tell me in the comments where you are listening from this evening. Share your name too, so I may know who keeps me company. If this story has given you steadiness, please like the video and subscribe. It helps more people find their way to plain words. And for those who wish to join a simple ritual, write this line beneath your name: I choose truth. If you can, add one small boundary you will keep this week, something practical and kind to yourself. Your words may become the rope someone else holds on to. Next time, I will tell you about the little church notebook, how a few scratched lines on a page helped me map where fear had been hiding, and how a single entry changed the way I saw my family forever. Until then, keep your sentence somewhere safe. And remember, chosen silence is rest, enforced silence is harm. We will walk the next part together.